I was the one who filed the incident report. So technically I was supposed to be objective, professional, just the facts, timestamps, witness account, no embellishment. That's what the Conclave of Seven asked for. That's what I gave them, on paper at least. But paper doesn't carry the weight of what I actually saw that day. Paper doesn't shake when you remember the moment. So I'm going to tell it the way it actually happened, the way it sits inside my chest even now, years later, like something that never fully settled. My name is Reth Kalavar. I am by species a Vihari. We're a tall people, silver-skinned, four-eyed, dual-respiratory. We don't scare easily. We've been in the interstellar conclave for 600 years. We've seen wars, collapses, the fall of the Drenathi Imperium, the quiet plague that took 3 member worlds in a single cycle. We've seen things. But I had never, in 31 years of service as a conclave floor officer, seen what I saw the day the humans took over the Chamber of Accord. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. The beginning explains everything. The Conclave of Seven is not a government. People get that wrong constantly. It's not a parliament, not a military alliance, not a trade bloc. It's all of those things at once and none of them cleanly. It's the closest thing the known galaxy has to a shared table. 41 member species, roughly 800 delegates on any given session day. The Chamber of Accord is where those delegates sit, vote, argue, and occasionally throw things at each other, which, depending on the species, can mean anything from a verbal insult to a bioluminescent spore cloud that causes temporary blindness. The chamber is located on Verath Station, a structure the size of a small moon anchored above the neutral world of Kalos Prime. Nobody owns Verath, everybody funds it. That's the arrangement. The station itself is ancient by any measure, first constructed by the Drenathi before their collapse, expanded 17 times since, with corridors and wings that don't always make architectural sense, because they were built by different species over different centuries, with different ideas about what a hallway should be. The Chamber of Accord is at the center of all of it. A sphere, perfectly spherical by design, 700 meters in diameter, with tiered seating arranged in concentric rings that float at adjustable heights. The floor isn't really a floor. It's a projection surface, a field of force-coherent light that can display maps, treaties, star charts, casualty counts, anything the session requires. The speaker's dais is at the geometric center. You reach it by walking across that field of light, which always feels slightly wrong regardless of how many times you do it. The Chamber of Accord is, by any honest reckoning, the most politically sensitive location in this part of the galaxy. And for 600 years, it had been guarded by the Accord Shield Corps, a multi-species security force drawn from member worlds, rotating every 3 cycles, highly trained, universally respected. Until the Vorn incident. I won't go into every detail of the Vorn incident because that's its own document, its own report, its own tragedy. The short version, 41 days before the session I'm describing, 3 members of the Accord Shield Corps, 2 Vorn and 1 Fethian, were implicated in a conspiracy that came within 19 minutes of killing the entire Conclave leadership. It wasn't an assassination in the clean sense. It was something worse. It was coordinated. It was patient. It had been building for 4 years inside the Shield Corps itself, using access codes, rotation schedules, and personal relationships. The Conclave didn't collapse, but it shook hard. In the aftermath, the Security Committee did what security committees always do when the thing they trusted turns out to be the threat. They panicked, argued for 6 days straight, and then made a decision that surprised everyone. They called the humans. I want to be honest about how I felt when I heard that. Not good. I was on the security oversight floor when Director Sanath Paul announced it. Sanath Paul is a Kethori, 8-limbed, calm, methodical, not given to impulsive decisions. When she said, the Human Security Directorate has been formally invited to provide temporary chamber protection for the duration of the 7th session, I thought I had misheard her through my translation implant. The Kethori delegate to my left, a junior analyst named Pri, actually laughed. Not meanly, just reflexively, the way you laugh when someone says something absurd. Humans, Pri said, seriously. Apparently seriously, I said. Humans had been Conclave members for 11 years. That's nothing. The Vihari had been members for 600 and were still considered newcomers by the oldest species. 11 years is a blink. Humans had 1 delegate seat, 1 observation tier, a small liaison office on sub-level 9, and a reputation that was complicated. Here's the thing about humans that the Conclave had collectively decided over 11 years was probably their defining characteristic. They were unpredictable, not dangerous exactly, not hostile, just you couldn't model them. Every other species in the Conclave could be mapped. The Vorn were hierarchical and responded to formal protocols. The Fethians valued information exchange above everything else. The Cathori were process-oriented and needed clear procedural frameworks. The Delvari were territorial but deeply honor-bound. Every species had a shape, a logic, a predictable response architecture. Humans had multiple shapes, simultaneously, depending on the individual, the moment, the context, the mood. They were, as the Fethian xenobiologist Terath Sol famously wrote in her species assessment, deeply, almost pathologically inconsistent in the most remarkably consistent way. They could be gentle and then fierce, formal and then loose, patient and then immediate, precise and then intuitive. The Conclave's security models didn't know what to do with that. And now, in the aftermath of an attack that had come from inside a trusted, modeled, mapped security force, the committee had apparently decided that unpredictable was exactly what they needed. I didn't agree, not yet, but I filed my reservations in the way a floor officer files reservations, quietly internally while doing my job. The humans arrived on Verath Station 4 days before the 7th session opened. I know this because I was on the receiving dock when their transport came in. Sanath Paul had assigned me as the Conclave liaison to the human security detail, partly because of my language implant's human dialect calibration, partly because I had worked the floor during the humans' 2 previous observation sessions, and partly, I think, because Sanath Paul trusted me to be professional even when I thought something was a mistake. The transport was not what I expected. I had expected something military, angular, armored, with weapon ports and shielding profiles that broadcast capability. Every security force I'd ever interacted with arrived in craft that announced themselves. Even the Delvari Honor Guard, who were personally one of the most composed security forces in the Conclave, flew ships that looked like drawn blades. The human transport was a medium-weight cargo hauler that had been modified for personnel. It was not ugly, exactly, but practical in a way that felt almost defiant. There were no obvious weapon ports, no ceremonial markings beyond a small emblem near the main hatch, a circle with 2 crossed lines, which I later learned was a simplified version of the old United Earth seal. No fanfare, no broadcast signal requesting an honor corridor. It just docked. The hatch opened, and they came out in a line. 23 humans. I had been briefed on the number, but seeing it felt strange. 23 to guard the Chamber of Accord. The standard shield corps deployment for a full session was 240 personnel across 6 shifts. 23 felt like a clerical error. They were in uniform, dark gray, close-fitting, without the overlapping plates or visible shield emitters I was used to seeing on security forces. Each of them carried a sidearm and what I later learned was called a tactical baton, a telescoping impact weapon about 40 centimeters long when collapsed. Their armor was present but not prominent. It was integrated into the suit itself, distributed, not decorative. They looked, compared to the Accord Shield Corps ceremonial kit, almost casual. The one at the front stopped in front of me. "Officer Calavar," she said. Her name was Commander Yeva Marsh. I know that now. At the moment she addressed me, what I registered was medium height for a human, which still put her a head shorter than me. Brown skin, dark eyes, hair cut close to her skull. A stillness about her that reminded me of the Cathori analysts, not the stillness of suppression, but the stillness of someone who had made a decision a long time ago about how to hold themselves. "I'm Commander Marsh," she said when I confirmed my name. "Human Security Directorate, we're here for the 7th session." "Yes," I said. "Welcome to Verath Station, I'm your Conclave liaison." "Good." She looked at me directly. Humans do that, I'd learned. They make eye contact as a form of communication rather than a challenge or a dominance signal, which had confused me in my first interactions with them. "I want a walkthrough of the Chamber of Accord and all connected corridors within the next 2 hours. Full access, no delay. Can you arrange that?" I told her I could. And I need the floor plans for every sublevel connected to the chamber, including the ones that were decommissioned in the last renovation cycle. I paused at that. "Those corridors are sealed. They haven't been in use for." "I know," she said. "That's why I want them." I arranged the walkthrough. That walkthrough taught me something. I had done the chamber orientation briefing probably 40 times in my career. I knew the space the way I knew my own office, automatically, without thinking. 240 meters from the main entry to the speaker's dais. 16 access corridors, 8 of which were active during sessions. 4 environmental control nodes, 3 emergency seal points. I could walk it in the dark. Commander Marsh walked it differently. She didn't take the route I offered her. She stopped at irregular intervals and looked at things that weren't on the standard briefing inventory. The junction between 2 wall panels, the angle of a support column, the distance between a ventilation seam and the nearest seating tier. She crouched down at one point and looked at the underside of a floating tier support strut for almost a full minute. One of her team, a tall, quiet man named Specialist Dorev, who turned out to be their explosive ordnance analyst, spent 40 minutes in a corridor I hadn't even thought to mention, pressing his hands against the walls and listening. They asked questions I had never been asked before. What's the maximum occupancy before the atmospheric processors shift to secondary cycling? When the force field floor is at full projection, does it affect the resonance of the lower ventilation ducts? These support rings on the floating tiers, hydraulic or magnetic. Which ones have manual overrides, and where are the override panels? If you needed to move someone from the speaker's dais to an emergency exit in under 90 seconds, which route would you use? And what happens to that route if the main lighting grid fails? I answered everything I could. For the things I didn't know off the top of my head, I pulled up the station schematics in real time. The questions kept coming. Not aggressively, they were never rude, never impatient, but steadily. Like they were building something in their heads, layer by layer, a model of the space that went beyond what was on any blueprint. At the end of the walkthrough, we were standing in the decommissioned sublevel 3 corridor, dusty, unlit, about 40 meters below the chamber floor. Marsh was shining a handheld light along the ceiling seam while Dorev marked something on his datapad. This corridor was sealed in the renovation cycle 23 years ago, I said. Nothing moves through here. Not officially, Marsh said. You think the Vorn group used it? I think that if I were going to access the Chamber of Accord without using any of the registered entry points, this is one of 3 routes I'd consider. She lowered the light. Has anyone swept this level since the Vorn incident? I checked my records. I already knew the answer. No. She nodded like I'd confirmed something she'd expected to confirm. We'll want to do a full sweep before the session opens. I'll need your authorization codes to access the sealed junction doors. I gave them to her. What I didn't say, standing there in that dusty, dead corridor, was that the thought had never crossed my mind. In 31 years, it had never occurred to me to worry about a decommissioned sublevel corridor 20 meters below the chamber floor. It wasn't on any active threat assessment. It wasn't in the standard briefing. It was just a closed door. Commander Marsh had walked into this station 4 hours ago and was already thinking about what was behind closed doors. The 7th session opened on schedule. 812 delegates from 41 member worlds. The agenda was, as all conclave agendas were, approximately 60% procedural and 40% genuinely consequential. There were resource arbitration motions from the outer ring worlds, a technology-sharing treaty between the Fethians and the Delvari that had been in negotiation for 11 years. A formal censure motion against the Gorath Combine for violating the Kalos maritime exclusion. And sitting at the top of the agenda, first session, first hour, a motion to formally restructure the Accord Shield Corps in light of the Vorn incident. That last one was why the tension in the Chamber of Accord, when the session opened, was something you could almost taste. Everybody knew that the humans were on the doors. Word had spread through the station in the way word always spreads on Varath, instantly and with a degree of embellishment. Some delegates thought it was temporary. Some thought it was an insult to the legacy security forces. 2 Vorn delegates had formally protested in writing. The Fethian representative, a cautious, careful diplomat named Velren, had submitted a memo questioning whether the humans had sufficient institutional experience for the role. And there, at every access point to the Chamber of Accord, standing at attention, 23 humans in dark gray, still and quiet. I was at my station on the oversight floor, an elevated gallery above the main seating tiers. where conclave officers monitor the session feeds, manage protocol flags, and coordinate with security. From up there, I had a clear view of the chamber floor and the 6 main entry corridors. The delegates came in. They found their tiers. The session opened. The humans didn't move. That was the first thing I noticed, and it sounds small, but it wasn't. The Accord Shield Corps had always maintained what was officially called dynamic patrol positioning. Guards rotated, circulated, maintained visibility by moving. There was a philosophy to it, developed over centuries. Visible movement signals vigilance. A guard standing still looks like a statue. A guard who moves looks like someone doing their job. The humans stood still. Not rigid, not frozen, but anchored. Each one at their designated position, shoulders back, weight settled, eyes doing the work that the rest of their bodies weren't. They watched the chamber the way, and this is the best way I can describe it, the way a predator watches a tree line, not scanning mechanically back and forth. Watching in the broader sense, taking in the whole space and noticing what changed within it. I found myself watching them instead of the session feed for the first 10 minutes. My Kithori colleague who had laughed at the announcement 4 days ago, sidled over to me at some point in the second hour. "They're very still," he said. "Yes," I said. Is that a human thing?" "I think it might be a training thing," I said, but I wasn't sure. I made a note to ask Commander Marsh later. The first incident happened in the 3rd hour of the first day. A Gorath delegate, heavyset, broad-shouldered, with the gray-scaled skin of his species and the layered ceremonial robes that the Gorath favored, attempted to enter the chamber through the secondary access corridor on the eastern face. He was not on the session manifest for that day. The Gorath Combine had 2 registered delegates for the 7th session. This was a 3rd individual. He had a Gorath diplomatic authentication seal, which was technically valid, and he was moving with the kind of deliberate, unhurried confidence that says, "I belong here, and you should not question me." The human at that access point was a young woman named Specialist Keed. I looked up her file later. She was 26 years old. She had been with the Human Security Directorate for 3 years. She was, by any measure, the most junior person on the detail. She stopped the Gorath delegate before he reached the entrance arch. "Sir," she said. He kept walking. "Sir," she said again, and she stepped sideways, not in front of him aggressively, but laterally, which put her in his path without confronting him head-on. It was a specific kind of movement, deliberately non-escalatory but completely effective. He stopped, looked at her. The Gorath expressed contempt with their outer scale ridges. They flatten and spread outward like a fan. His were fully spread. "I am Delegate Vren of the Gorath Combine," he said through his translator. "I require access to the chamber." "Yes, sir," Specialist Keed said. She did not step aside. "I'll need to verify your session manifest registration. Can you state your authorization code?" "My seal is..." "I see the seal, sir. I need the authorization code." I was watching this on my oversight monitor, and I realized my hand had gone still on my desk. The Gorath delegate outweighed Specialist Keed by probably 4 times. He was a species whose threat posture historically involved expanding himself to fill space. He was doing that now, shoulders back, scale ridges wide, chin elevated. Specialist Keed did not change her position or her expression. She waited. "This is an insult," Vren said. "I demand to speak with the Conclave Security Director immediately." "Absolutely, sir. I can connect you with Officer Calavar on the oversight floor. In the meantime, if you'd like to wait in the reception alcove, I'd appreciate it if you..." "I will not wait in..." "Sir," and that was different. The word was the same, but something in the register shifted. Not louder, not harder, just precise, like a door closing. "The session is in progress. You are not on the manifest. Until your authorization is verified, you will wait in the reception alcove, or I will need to ask you to return to the General Station Concourse. Those are the 2 options I have available to you." There was a pause. The Gorath delegate Vren was a career diplomat. He had been navigating the conclave for 30 years. He could read situations, and something in that pause I watched his scale ridges and they folded, just slightly, not a submission. More like a recalibration. "Fine," he said, "I will wait." He went to the alcove. I immediately pulled up his credentials in our system. He was, as it turned out, a legitimate Gorath representative, a third-party observer, not a full delegate whose paperwork had been submitted but not yet cleared by the conclave registration office due to a processing backlog. The situation was resolved in 20 minutes. He entered the chamber. He filed no formal complaint, which surprised several people who knew him. What surprised me more was Specialist Keed's conduct throughout. She was polite, correct, and completely immovable. Not because she was rigid. I had seen enough rigid security personnel to know the difference. She was immovable because she had made a decision about where the line was and simply stayed there. I thought about that for a long time. Day 2 brought a different kind of test. The technology-sharing treaty between the Fethians and the Delvari had hit a procedural snag, something about ratification timeline language, and by mid-session the floor was running hot. The Delvari honor structure meant that certain kinds of procedural challenges read, to them, as personal affronts rather than process corrections. Their lead delegate, a senior diplomat named Harathvel, had stood up from his tier and was doing what Delvari do when they feel disrespected. Standing at full height, which, for an adult Delvari, is considerable, with his display frills at maximum extension, and speaking in the formal mode that their culture uses for declarations of grievance. The chamber was not in immediate danger. Nobody was about to start a fight. The Delvari have strict protocols about physical conflict in diplomatic settings. The culture around it is deeply ritualized and requires a whole series of escalating formal exchanges before anything physical is even theoretically on the table. We all knew this. But it was loud, and it was escalating. And several of the smaller species delegates, particularly the Yethri, who have a fight-or-flight response that's triggered by loud, sustained vocalization, were visibly distressed. What happened next was not in any protocol manual I had ever read. Sergeant Elliot Ramos, one of the senior human guards, stationed at the inner ring near the Delvari delegation tier, stepped forward and asked, through the chamber's audio system, to be recognized by the speaker. The speaker, an elderly Kethori named Formast, blinked all 3 of her eyes in sequence, which is a Kethori expression of confusion. Nobody ever asked to be recognized from the security positions. That wasn't done. But she recognized him, probably because the situation was already irregular enough that more irregular felt approximately the same. Sergeant Ramos spoke, not loudly. The chamber audio system carried it, but he didn't raise his voice. "Delegate Harathvel," he said, "with respect, I've been standing in this chamber for 2 days and I've noticed something. Your words carry further when you speak at this particular volume than when you go higher. You might not know that. The Delvari vocal range has a lot of overtones that the lower frequencies cut through better in a sphere this size." There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds. Harathvel turned and looked at the human sergeant. "I'm not asking you to stop or calm down," Ramos continued. "Your grievance is your business and not mine. I'm just, for whatever it's worth, telling you that if you want the whole chamber to hear every word, the mid-register is where you'll land them best." Another pause. Then Harathvel did something I had not seen a Delvari in formal grievance mode do in 30 years of watching conclave sessions. He lowered his display frills by about 1/3. Not fully, that would have been a statement of submission, which was not appropriate. Just enough to say, "I have heard the information and I am choosing how to use it." "Thank you, Sergeant," he said, in standard conclave common, not the formal grievance mode. The session moved on. I don't know if Ramos calculated that. I don't know if he knew Delvari formal modes or had just observed Harathvel's behavior for 2 days and identified something that would redirect the energy without challenging it. I asked him about it later, during an off shift. He shrugged. "He wanted to be heard," Ramos said. "Usually when someone wants to be heard, the most useful thing you can do is help them actually be heard. Then they can get to whatever the next step is." I wrote that in my personal notes that night. Not my official notes, my personal ones. Day 5. This is the part I have trouble writing even now. Day 5 of the 7th session was when we found out that the Vorn incident had not, in fact, been fully resolved. The formal investigation had identified 3 conspirators. It had closed on that number with high confidence. What it had not identified, what nobody had identified, because it was impossible to see from the official records, was that there had been a 4th. His name is still under seal, so I'll call him what the investigation report called him, undisclosed actor 4. He had been part of the SHIELD Corps for 7 years. He had not been in the chamber on the day of the Vorn incident because he had been on an assigned rotation elsewhere, which was part of why he'd escaped the initial investigation sweep. He had, as far as anyone could tell, been waiting. Waiting for the 7th session specifically. Because the 7th session was when the motion to restructure the Accord SHIELD Corps would be formally voted on. And that vote, if it passed, would change the access structures, the authentication systems, and the personnel rotation protocols that he had spent 4 years mapping. He could not let it pass. We found out later that he had been on station for 3 days before the session started, using a set of credentials that were legitimate enough to pass automated checks, but that Commander Marsh's team had flagged as anomalous on day 2, not because they were obviously fake, but because the entry timestamps didn't pattern match the behavioral profile of the individual they were assigned to. I did not know this on day 5 morning. I was at my oversight station when the shift started and nothing felt wrong. At 09:14 station time, Specialist Dorev, the explosive ordnance analyst, the one who had spent 40 minutes pressing his hands against walls in the decommissioned corridor, sent Commander Marsh a one-line message on their internal channel. I have her incident transcript. The message was, "Sublevel 3 Junction 7, come now." Marsh was on the chamber floor. She left her position, which means she briefed Sergeant Ramos to expand his coverage arc, tapped 2 other specialists to adjust positions, and was in the decommissioned corridor within 4 minutes of receiving the message. I did not know any of this was happening. The session was underway. The restructuring motion was under formal debate. Delegate Velren of the Fethians was speaking, methodically, carefully, as Fethians always do, about the operational history of the SHIELD Corps. At 09:31, Commander Marsh sent a message to my official channel. "Officer Calavar, we have a situation. Do not sound any alarms. Come to Sublevel 3 Junction 7. Bring your override credentials and tell no one." I stared at that message for probably 3 full seconds. Then I did what she said. Sublevel 3 Junction 7 was a sealed doorway in the decommissioned corridor, the one Marsh had asked about on the first day. When I arrived, I found Dorev, Marsh, and 2 other specialists. Dorev was crouched at the base of the sealed door with a scanning device I didn't recognize pressed against the floor. Marsh looked at me when I came in. No greeting, she pointed at the door. "Someone cut the magnetic lock from the other side 2 days ago and reseated it to look intact from this direction. There's a person in there, one individual, not moving right now. We think they're in a wait state." "In a wait?" "Waiting for a trigger. We think they're listening to the session audio." She held up a small device, a receiver, I realized, tuned to the chamber's open broadcast frequency. Anyone attending the session could be listening to this on an open channel, including someone in a sealed corridor 20 meters below the chamber floor. I felt something cold move through me. "What's in there with them?" Dorev answered without looking up from his scanner. "I'm reading a chemical signature consistent with high-temperature dispersal materials. The composition is consistent with a disruption agent, probably non-lethal, targeting atmospheric processors. If the processors pulled it in and distributed it through the chamber's circulation system," he paused, "the session would have to be evacuated. In the process, the vote doesn't happen. The restructuring motion fails by default under conclave rules if a session is interrupted and not resumed within the same cycle." Silence in that dusty corridor. "So they weren't going to kill anyone," I said. "Probably not," Marsh said. "Just derail the vote, create enough chaos to reset the timeline." Probably had a second play ready for when the restructuring motion came back to the table in the next cycle. "How did you find this?" Marsh looked at Dorev, who finally looked up from his scanner. "The floor," he said. "Excuse me." "The dust on the floor," he pointed along the corridor. "This sublevel hasn't been opened in 23 years. Dust settles in specific patterns based on air circulation and the mass displacement of foot traffic. The pattern down here was wrong. Someone had been through here recently and tried to redistribute the dust to hide the passage. They did a decent job." He almost smiled. "But not if you know what to look for." I looked at Marsh. "What do we do?" She had clearly already decided. You're going to go back up to your oversight station and send a channel message to the session speaker to call a 5-minute procedural recess. Use the scheduling authority in your liaison credentials. You have it correct. I did. Floor officers could call short procedural recesses for administrative purposes without a formal motion. During those 5 minutes, Marsh said, we're going to open this door. Is it safe to? Safer than waiting for them to decide the moment is right, she said. We have Dorev, we have containment equipment, and we have the element of surprise. What we don't have is time to call in a full response team without tipping off whoever is in there that we've found them. I looked at the sealed door. I looked at the 23-year dust on the floor, still showing the ghost of footprints that shouldn't have been there. Okay, I said. I went back up. I called the recess. I gave the speaker a reason and authentication processing queue issue which was boring enough to be completely plausible. The session paused. Delegates stretched. Conversations started. Velren looked mildly irritated at the interruption, which was the correct response for someone in the middle of a measured and carefully prepared speech. At 09:44 over my earpiece, I heard Dorev say clear, in a voice that had no elevation in it whatsoever. At 09:46, Marsh's voice, subject is contained, advise the recess can end. I called the session back to order. The 7th session resumed. Velren picked up exactly where he had left off, which is exactly the kind of thing Fethians do. The restructuring motion went to vote 2 hours later. It passed by a margin of 37-4. The person in the corridor, undisclosed Actor 4, who had spent 3 days on Verath Station, and 2 of those days in a sealed, decommissioned corridor, was taken into conclave custody without incident, without alarm, without a single delegate knowing anything unusual had happened. I have read the containment report. The operation took 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The human team used no weapons. The subject was physically restrained. The dispersal materials were secured in a containment vessel, and the corridor was sealed with fresh locks before the session's recess ended. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I am writing this now, sometime after the 7th session, because I was asked to. Sanath Paul wanted an officer's account, not just the official incident report. She wanted the texture of it, what it felt like from the floor. What it felt like? It felt like watching people who understood something about their environment, any environment that I had stopped noticing about mine. The Chamber of Accord was a place I had worked for 20 years. I knew it the way you know a room you've lived in so long you stop seeing it. The humans walked in and saw it fresh. They saw the dust on the decommissioned floor. They heard the way sound traveled in a sphere. They noticed the timestamps that didn't match the behavioral patterns. They saw the closed door and asked what was behind it. I have thought a lot about the question of why they were chosen. Why the committee, in the aftermath of the Vorn incident, sent out the call to a species 11 years into their conclave membership with no history as a security institution, no established galactic reputation, no centuries of protocol behind them. I have a theory. Every other species in the conclave had spent enough time in that chamber to stop really seeing it. Our threat assessments were built on what had happened before. Our patrol patterns were built on what had worked before. Our trust was calibrated to the institutions we had built over centuries, and those institutions had, very nearly, killed everyone in that chamber. The humans had no before. They had no established pattern to fall back on, no institutional muscle memory that could be compromised, no mental map of the chamber that had been built by someone else's assumptions. They walked in and looked, really looked. At the dust, at the doors, at the distance between a ventilation seam and a seating tier, at the way a Delvari diplomat's voice moved through a spherical room. They were unpredictable, yes. Every conclave assessment of humanity had landed on that word like it was a flaw. I no longer think it was a flaw. I think it was the whole point. Commander Marsh filed her final shift report on the last day of the session. I was copied on it as liaison. The report was 3 pages. The executive summary was 6 sentences. The last one said, no delegate was harmed during the 7th session. The Chamber of Accord remained secure throughout. All incidents were resolved without disruption to session proceedings. Recommend full schematic review of decommissioned sublevels across all Verath Station wings before next session cycle. 6 sentences, for 11 days of work, for one containment operation that nobody in the chamber knew had happened. For 23 humans who had stood still in a room full of 800 delegates from 41 species, and quietly, methodically, without ceremony or announcement, kept all of them safe. I shook Marsh's hand when they left. Humans do that. I'd learned the gesture, it felt right. "Thank you," I said. She looked at me with those direct human eyes. "Just the job," she said. And she walked back to her transport, which looked like a cargo hauler that hadn't been designed to impress anyone. I watched it undock from the bay and move away from the station, and I thought about the dust on the sub-level floor, and the question Marsh had asked on her first day, 4 hours after arriving on Verath Station. What's behind the closed doors? That's the thing about humans. They always want to know what's behind the closed doors. And in my experience now, having watched them work, having stood in that dusty corridor and understood what we almost didn't find, that quality, that relentless need to look at the thing everyone else has already decided is not worth looking at. That's not unpredictability. That's exactly the kind of people you want standing between you and everything you haven't thought to be afraid of yet.